If the governor signs the bill into law, beginning with the class of 2027, Iowa students would have to take another test before they can graduate high school.
Today, the Iowa House followed what the Senate already passed and agreed on, a proposal that would require students to pass a civics test. The questions come from the test immigrants in the process of becoming citizens are required to take. Students would have to score at least a 60% on the multiple choice test, but they can take the test as many times as they need to pass.
Republican State Representative Bob Henderson is the bill's floor manager. He says if immigrants wanted to become citizens have to take it, Iowa students should have to know the answers too. But Democratic State Representative Amy Wickendall says schools will have to pay for that test themselves.
Why would we not have at least the same requirement of the proof of the knowledge of that framework for someone who now is poised to enter that same responsibility simply because they have lived to a certain age?
I do not believe this body has the right to complain about property taxes when it keeps loading up our schools with more and more unfunded mandates. I believe that if this legislature is going to be in the business of telling schools what they have to teach, we should have to give them the funding to do so.
One lawmaker, Democrat Eleanor Levin of Iowa City, tried to add an amendment to the bill requiring all legislators to take the test and publish their score. Republican lawmakers voted against it and defeated it.
That would be interesting.